Every survivor has an unbelievable story, but this is a true story. This is a difficult interview. People have avoided talking about it for too long. We never even talked about it with our families. My father was a lawyer. He didn't tell me until after 1945 that he was unhappy when he found out that they were expecting a child. Hitler had just come to power. My father could see that the country where he was born, which he loved deeply, was lost to Jews. And he certainly didn't want to start a family at that time. His very religious parents were, of course, against it. He was their favorite son. And imagine how they felt that he didn't want to follow the path they'd seen for him. So my mother agreed to convert to Judaism. And she did, and then they got married. My father made him see that it made no sense to run a business during those times, that anti-Semitic age. He could tell his regular customers felt uncomfortable going to a Jewish store, even if he had quality products. But that wasn't enough for him to keep going.
Aber das war für ihn keine Grundlage mehr, das weiterzuführen.
My grandmother then gave up her beautiful apartment. I still remember the big clock with such a nice chime. Children have all kinds of memories that you wouldn't imagine would last, but they do. It was just a normal middle-class home. And then my mother gave in to the Gestapo's pressure.
Thematik, dass meine Mutter diesen Druck der Gestapo nicht aushalten konnte.
My father told me the Gestapo brought her in a few times to let her know that if she stayed with a Jew, she would suffer the same fate. Her fate could be different from what was planned for the Jews.
Als wie für die Juden vorgesehen.
She did so much for me. She made learning religion fun and also took me on little trips and excursions. She was an excellent substitute mother. She was a real lady. Back then, she always wore a narrow black velvet ribbon around her neck. She was even wearing it the last time I saw her. The children from the entire neighborhood used to play in the big front yard of an apartment building across the street. Thinking back, I don't think they even knew I was Jewish, or at least it wasn't mentioned. There was a really big, heavy gate. It wouldn't open, and I thought it was stuck. But the caretaker, who I knew, then came up to the gate. She said, "Go home. Our children are not allowed to play with a Jewish child." And I saw all my friends hanging on the bars of the fence, looking at me, funnily. I thought they wanted to play some kind of game with me, but then they went away. When I realized that I was alone, I started crying hysterically and went home. My grandmother didn't see it and didn't know why I was back. She had to explain it to me. And that's the first time I heard the word Jew. I didn't know what it meant.
Für mich war das kein Begriff.
I guess I thought that everyone was the same and that there were no differences. That was the first time I realized we were different and were seen differently than the people around me. My father was disbarred as an attorney and became what they called a consulant. He could only defend Jewish people. Naturally, it was just a charade, a joke. Jewish people no longer had any rights. The Nazi era, when the Nuremberg Laws gave the Nazis free rein to terrorize Jews or to hassle them, or for the Gestapo to torture Jews, anyone who was summoned to the Gestapo didn't know if they would come out alive. They always came in the early morning, when it was still dark, and rang the doorbell loudly. The first time we were very scared. The next times, we knew who it was. They always came in their leather coats and their military hats. I can still picture it exactly. Then they came and took the men in the families. Sometimes just for interrogation, sometimes to send them to Dachau. The name Dachau was already known among Jews because they knew what happened there. Once they came during the day and kept ringing the doorbell. I can't say if my father knew or just had a feeling. Our apartment had 2 exits. He went out the back as they were coming in the front. He didn't say anything. He just vanished. When I asked him later where he went, he said he was in the caretaker's apartment. They were very nice people. But the Gestapo came in, and my grandmother told him he wasn't there. It was a nice middle-class apartment with lots of rooms. They searched them all and saw me standing there. They asked me where my father was. I knew, but I didn't say a word. When I didn't answer, one slapped me twice across the face and asked me again. I cried because it really hurt, but he must have realized he wouldn't get anything out of me. And then they left. Everyone was very worried until I calmed down again. I was just a child. I'll never forget that terrible pain.
Mein Kind.
One day we were walking on the Theresienwiese, a nice day with lots of people around. This green car suddenly just stopped in the middle of the road. Two men in leather coats got out and demanded ID from the people who were walking. I felt a hand pulling me away and putting my hand on a stroller. A horrible situation. I looked at my father, who signaled that I shouldn't look at him. The men were writing something down. Then a married couple led me away and immediately asked where I lived. And they told me to run home quickly and explain what had happened. I saw them take him away. And I really didn't think I would see him again. Because I knew what was happening. I had heard too much. I had experienced too much of what people said. Our family was affected by these things too. Other families suffered similar fates. No Jewish family was spared. They took my father to Edstraße, to the police department.
Polizeihauptquartier, oder wie man das sagt. Und da hat noch das, was jetzt kommt.
He later told me what happened. He met a lot of well-known men there, only men. And when it was my father's turn, he said his name, Siegfried Neuland. The man sitting in the middle looked at him and told him to step out of the line. He thought that was going to be his death sentence. He didn't know why he was supposed to step aside. None of the others had to. And the man said, Neuland, you don't recognize me? And my father really hadn't recognized him. And the man said, I'll tell you why you should recognize me.
Warum Sie mich eigentlich kennen sollten.
You once represented me in a legal matter. And when I didn't have the money to pay my bill, you told me, okay, then pay it when you can.
Haben Sie zu mir gesagt, okay, dann zahlen Sie es, wenn Sie können.
And now I can repay you. Go home. Things like that also happened.
Das hat's auch gegeben. kam der 9. November 1938.
Then came the 9th of November, 1938. My father had been warned to get his family out of the house. Something was being planned against the Jews.
Das hat dann sofort machen
He
wollen.
didn't hesitate, but wanted to take my grandmother with us.
Fällt auf.
But she wouldn't leave because it would attract attention. She stayed at home. It was November and cold. I still remember her putting my cap on me and tying my scarf.
Und dann wollte sein Freund.
He wanted to warn his friend, Councillor Rothschild. So we crossed the valley and saw the broken windows in the Ulfelder department store. There were a lot of Jewish businesses back then. Some people were looting things. Some were standing and watching. We didn't stop. We just kept on walking until we reached the area around Sendlinger Tor Square, where Councillor Rothschild lived.
In der Gegend vom Sendlinger Torplatz zu warnen.
Before we even reached his house, we saw a green police car, and Grandpa Rothschild came out just as we arrived. He wasn't my real grandpa, but I always called him that because he had so much white hair, and I had lost my own grandfather. He came out, or was dragged out by the arms by two men. He had a bandage here on his forehead, and it was soaked with blood. He saw us and immediately looked away. He didn't want the men to see that we knew him. They shoved him into the car and kicked him. That was the last we ever saw of him. My father said we had to get out of there quickly.
I
watched him thinking about what to do next. Then he said we were going to Gauting, where a good friend of his lived. He didn't want to take the main road, but because he loved nature, he knew his way through the country. We walked all the way from the city center to Gauting, to the Kasselmanns, a married couple. When we arrived, my father told them what had happened. Mr. Kasselmann said without hesitation, "You'll stay the night with us." And that was that. The next day, we went back. Everything was back to normal. The first deportation trains, the people were taken out of the trains, led straight to the pits, and all shot. All of them. But the ones who did it, the police or whoever, they told their families what happened. Because apparently they didn't like seeing small children, toddlers. The youngest was half a year old, who were on the train, who were simply shot.
The
Gestapo didn't organize the deportations themselves. There was no Jewish community anymore, just an office. They appointed a Jewish representative, Mr. Korocek. I'll never forget him. I forget your name, but I can't forget his name. I can see him. I knew him. And he had to fill out the list with people, acquaintances, although he knew it was a death list. Those were the last minutes with my grandmother. I can still see her. And this horrible official, he told my father there was a children's, an adults, and a seniors transport, and he had to put someone on a list. My grandmother volunteered, of course. At some point, she said goodbye to me and told me she was going to a spa and would be back. The word spa has sounded dreadful to me ever since. I sobbed, and so did she. You can't imagine. The end of my childhood. My father had become terrified because it had come so close to his family, gotten so close to his family, that he was looking for a way to get me away from it all. He didn't know how, but he just didn't want me there. He later said that if anything had happened, he would have sacrificed himself. He called my uncle's former maid in a village near Nuremberg. Someone from the little village post office had to go to her home and tell her that a Mr. Neuland wanted to speak to her. Hard to imagine today, in these days of modern technology. Mündlich aufgefordert, wenn man sich das so vorstellt, in die heutige Technik. Das ist ja ganz She didn't know why she was being summoned, but she knew the name Neuland. And he asked if she could take me in for a while. Guter Begriff. Und dann hat gesagt, ob sie mich für einige Zeit aufnehmen würde. Wir haben uns dann auf die Reise gemacht. So we took a trip. We didn't wear the yellow stars. My father told me to sit in one carriage and he would sit in the other, and that I should look out of the window at every station. And if I saw the SS getting on the train, I was to get off immediately and wait for him at the station. I asked him later what he'd been thinking. I was supposed to wait for him in the station? If the SS had come, if they had taken him, what would have happened to me? He said he didn't know either. It's easy to say, but people went through a lot. But the train wasn't being watched. We arrived in Nuremberg and walked for 2.5 hours to the little village. There were 2 sisters, one of whom was my savior, and an 80-year-old father. The sons were fighting in the war. And my father kept pacing back and forth in the room. I still see him back and forth, back and forth. And then they came back and said they had decided to take me in for a while. But if we couldn't find a legal way, I would have to leave. I wouldn't be allowed to stay. I can't describe my feelings when I said goodbye to my father. I thought I would never see him again.
Weil ich ja mir auch vorgestellt habe, das ist das letzte Mal, dass ich ihn sehe.
It was a terrible feeling.
Aber gut.
But it was good that this woman, her name was Zenzi, she was extremely pious. She was very, very religious. The village women saw me, of course, and said she had brought her bastard to live with her. That's what they called an illegitimate child.
Jetzt hat sie ihren Bankert gebracht. Das war natürlich ein Ausdruck für ein außereheliches Kind.
She wasn't married. She had never had a husband, and they said it to her face.
Auch ins Gesicht gesagt. Und das hat sie mir später gesagt, das kam von oben.
But she felt that it had come from God above, so she knew she could take it. So she said yes. She told everyone, and they threw the word bastard in her face all of those years. That's how people are.
So sind Menschen. Und dann musste ich zum Ortsbauernführer.
I had to go to the village's rationing officer, and I can still see the swastika he had on his green uniform.
Grüne Uniform.
He had an office, and he got up to meet us as we were walking in. He must have seen us from the window. He said, "Ah, so you've brought your bastard." He didn't want to know anything about me. He was just responsible for issuing ration cards, and the matter was settled. I was legal.
Das hat sie natürlich dadurch gelindert.
Telling the village priest everything helped lessen her burden.
Dass sie dem alles erzählt hat.
When I think back, he did a lot to help too.
Lange zurückdenke, hat auch sehr viel geleistet.
He had to take me into the church. He arranged everything so nobody noticed.
Alles arrangiert. Aber so, dass keiner gemerkt hat. Nur ich jeden Tag.
I had to go to the church early every morning until an SS battalion occupied the village.
Von einem SS-Bataillon.
They were retreating from the Americans, and we could already hear the shots and artillery fire in the distance.
Das hat man schon von der Ferne gehört.
The priest was afraid because he didn't know how long they were going to stay. Nobody knew what was happening, or how long they would stay, or when the Americans would come.
Ich bin dorthin gekommen.
When I went into the shelter, forced laborers from Poland were already in there. Women and men. The women were crying. They were so scared. Then the SS left, and the Americans liberated the village. They went up the hill and sat on their tanks and threw gum to the children, just like you see in the movies.
Auf ihren Panzern gesessen und haben den Kindern Kaugummi zugeworfen. Das kann man sich, also
it's hard to imagine.
Aber es war so.
And then the war was over.
Dann war der Krieg aus. Ob mein Vater noch lebt?
In my heart, I had already buried my father. I had known about all the horrors when I was still with him.
als ich noch mit ihm zusammen war.
I was convinced that I didn't have anyone left.
Ich war davon überzeugt, dass ich jetzt niemanden mehr habe. Mein Vater kam dann nach
But my father came some months later.
Krankenhaus, aber gar nicht fähig.
He'd been in the hospital and wasn't in any condition for anything. Everything had been destroyed. No news, no post office. There was nothing left. I was driving a wagon with a double team of cows when he showed up. They don't move very fast. And I heard a car coming up behind me.
Und dann höre ich, dass ein Auto hinter mir kommt. Und die linke,
the left cow hated cars.
Die hatte
and she panicked.
Autos und hat dann einen Tempo, dass sie alles zerrissen hat. Also
I got down off the wagon, stood in front of her and hugged her so she wouldn't see the car.
Das Auto nicht wahrnimmt. Und dann sehe ich es ungefähr
it passed us
20, 30 Meter
and then stopped about 20, 30 meters in front of me. I thought, for God's sake, now I have to drive past that car with this crazy cow. She hated cars. She would have hated this modern world. Anyway, as I got closer, someone got out, and it was my father. My goodness, it was, you can't imagine.
Ich habe dort Freunde gehabt.
I had friends there on the farm. All the animals were my friends. They knew my secrets, everything. And they listened too. At least I pretended they did. I didn't want to leave my friends. That was the worst thing I could imagine, but I had to. I didn't want to go back to Munich. I didn't want to be with the people who had ostracized us, insulted us, who had spat at us, who hated us. And I knew they were still there. And I was right. Even the caretaker, they were all there. And everyone was so friendly and so nice and so kind, happy, and thanking God we were back and healthy. You wouldn't have believed it. Really, if you hadn't known what humans were like before, you did then. People as they really are. That was my first question. Where's Grandma? And he told me that she hadn't survived. Then I met my future husband. I was very young, and he wasn't interested in me, but I only had eyes for him. When I was older, we began dating. Eventually, we got married. No one who stayed wanted to stay. Every couple, every person who did stay had their own reasons. I loved my children and wanted the best for them. So we stayed.
Wissen Sie, bei einem jungen Menschen.
You know, you're a young person and you have such anger. And it gets transferred to various people. It manifests itself in the people you meet. When you live in the country that did that, that was very difficult. Very, very difficult. The Jewish people who resettled did not resettle in Germany, but in the land of the murderers. This was the land of the murderers. The Jews lived in a kind of self-inflicted ghetto. There was an unseen bond between us. We were connected. We were, on the one side, the victims, and the murderers on the other.
Man hat sich selbst getäuscht.
You had to lie to yourself. You pretended to be a person who had never actually existed. But you had to live with it. You tried to find people who had nothing to do with it. These people did exist, and they did a great deal. You tried to find people, for whatever reason, who had not supported the National Socialist system. They were your support. They were there. They were simply afraid. I can remember it very well. Some of them were even in official positions. But we knew that every sitting judge there had a colored past. My father knew it too. Nobody talked about it, neither amongst the victims nor amongst the culprits. Nobody spoke about it with the next generation. I needed a long time, many years, until my children were much older. We lived amongst ourselves, isolated from the rest of the world. My older children were never allowed to bring school friends home.
Ein Schulfreund oder Schulding nach Hause bringen dürfen.
The younger ones did.
Die Jüngere, ja.
That was progress.
Das war eine Entwicklung. Nach vielen Jahren, das ist jetzt vielleicht
many years later, perhaps 20 years ago, I got a call from a man. I'm so-and-so, and if you have time, I'd like to talk to you, and about your past.
Auch über die Vergangenheit. Okay, bin ich dorthin.
I agreed, and we met.
Bilder waren da.
When I arrived, he had a pile of pictures he'd taken in a camp over the years, but he didn't say what they were. He introduced himself and told me he had been the head of the Milbertshofen deportation camp, where people had had to stay for a few days before their deportation.
Dort ein paar Tage gelebt haben. Sag ich, und so was brauchen Sie mich?
And why do you need me?
Sagte, ich wollte Ihnen sagen.
He told me he wanted me to know that he felt very guilty. At first, he had been enthusiastic and did what he was told. But he had felt guilty and expressed his remorse. He wanted to tell me personally that he couldn't undo his crimes, and he gave me the big stack of photos that he had taken over the years at the camp. And that was it.
Und das war's.
It really affected me because I knew my grandmother had been there. It was part of her, of the life she then had to live there. It was the start. This camp in Milbertshofen, where the Jews were put into the train cars. We now need political education, starting in kindergarten. I think it's very important to give young people political education, that they grow up together, as I've supported. Our kindergartens and elementary and high schools have both Jewish and non-Jewish children. It's so important that the children grow up together and that both sides see that the other is no different from themselves. The baton of remembrance has already been passed on to you. The time of eyewitnesses who can still testify to what they experienced, what people experienced, will soon be over. You are the ones with the duty and the task of maintaining these memories. Not only that you commemorate, but that people know, that young people know what people can do to other people. And you can only do that by remembering, by commemorating, by putting the facts on the table. And the next generation of the non-Jewish population is very important in maintaining this commemoration and remembrance together. That's all. Not to recount what happened, but just to guarantee that it doesn't happen again. That is very, very important to me. My assignment to all of you.